Hi folks, I'm here to answer your questions from week 2. So I want to mention first of all that in the upcoming weeks I'm going to be more of a stickler on the questions, really focusing on the literature or a matter very closely related to the literature. I'm not doing it to be a jerk. If you think I'm a jerk, then please don't tell me. I'm not trying to be mean by doing it, but I do want to focus on the literature. Now, my camera is going nuts, so give me a moment. I'm going to pause and see if I can handle this. Okay, apparently putting on my jacket and creating some more contrast fixes the issue. I'm not an AV person or a visual tech person, so if you knew it before I did, I've got a lot to learn. So before we get into the questions, I'll say this. I grouped the questions together and going to try and maybe run through multiple questions. Some of them stand alone, and whether they're grouped or alone, they're all, I think they're all reasonable questions. So before I start answering them, I want to go over a matter I probably should have discussed in the overview concerning modes of reading. Now, Dante actually talks about 4 modes of reading in a work called the Convivio, the Banquet. And it was supposed to be an encyclopedic work, almost like about everything. That I might be overselling it a little bit. But in book 2 of the Convivio, which he never finished, I think he only wrote 4 books of the Convivio, he talks about 4 modes of reading. Dante did not make up these modes of reading. We can find them in other places in literature. When I teach Middle English literature, for example, there's an excerpt that we read from, I forgot the author's name, but we read an excerpt that also talks about 4 modes of literature. When I teach Renaissance literature, which includes Renaissance literary criticism, so literary criticism from the 15th and 16th century, 16th century really, the poets are thinking through modes of reading, and they also talk about these 4 modes of reading. Now, the 4 modes can vary a little bit. I'm going to use Dante's because they're the most common. So Dante's 4 modes are literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical. The modes are not levels. So in the past, I have talked about the modes as levels, and it's probably not the most accurate way to describe them. They're modes, and they can be used at various times in various places in literature. Sometimes it's appropriate only to use one of them. Sometimes it can be appropriate to use all 4 of them or any combination of them. It just depends. The literal mode is the plain sense. It's the usual mode we think of when we read. So literally, Dante is walking underground with Virgil the poet, witnessing the punishments in hell. Right? Literally, that's what's going on. Metaphorically, what's going on, or allegorically what's going on, is Dante is learning what sin is really like. So the metaphor of the journey is the recognition of sin. So the allegorical mode is the symbolic meaning. Now, sometimes those can flip around a little bit. If I were to tell you that it's raining cats and dogs, you would hear it in the allegorical mode, right? You would not hear it in the literal mode. You wouldn't think, I don't imagine anyway, that you would think literally cats and dogs are falling. You would, through your language acquisition and habituation to words and the way words are used in speech, you would know that I'm not speaking literally. So that would be a different mode. And sometimes some phrases lend themselves more to more to allegorical than to literal. The other 2 modes are somewhat unusual. If you grew up in the Sunday school tradition, they might not be unusual to you, though. So the moral mode we could think of as didactic, teaching a lesson about how we ought to behave. Words like should, ought, or must, or should not, ought not, or must not would be associated with the moral mode. So in the moral mode, Dante walking, through the levels of hell, the moral mode might show us that we should not ignore sin, right? That's a didactic point. It's something that we should not do. Or we should realize that sin has a devastating effect, or that it's separating us from God is particularly alarming, and that we should flee from sin. So that would be the moral mode of reading. The fourth mode, so a strange name, is called the anagogical mode. Anagogical. Anagogical. And the anagogical mode is a mode whereby we recognize some universal application, some kind of like overarching truth. So an anagogical reading of, or the anagogical mode of reading in the Inferno could be that all sin separates us from God. All sin deserves punishment. That would be an anagogical understanding of the Inferno. There are places where, in literature, where, like I said, perhaps the literal mode is the only appropriate mode, or perhaps a combination of literal and allegorical. Because Dante talks about them explicitly in Convivio, and because he actually, in a letter that he sent to his friend Congrande della Scala, he says, he sends him a copy of the Paradiso, and he tells him the entire comedy is really about the exodus of Israel from Egypt. And he doesn't mean that literally, he means that allegorically. And it was very common in the Middle Ages to think of Christian experience as the exodus of the soul from the slavery of sin in Egypt and coming into the promised land, the salvation offered by the Lord. So that's not an uncommon way of thinking about Old Testament history in these allegorical terms to describe Christian experience. It was a way to think about Christian experience scripturally. So that is why it's relevant to think about those matters when we are reading the Inferno. And some of the questions that we have might be cleared up or addressed in fruitful ways by thinking about these four modes of reading. So and I know I've been talking about Dante, but this also counts for the earlier poem, The Dream of the Rood. So let me start with the Dream of the Rood questions. Herbert, and remember, if I look off into space, it's because I have to pull up the document. Herbert F. Asks, he says that he notices that the cross and the crucifixion are, they figure prominently in the poem, and asks, would it cause skepticism, or is it something like the gospel where you would have a different way of telling a certain event? And this may go back to our modes of reading. So in the allegorical mode, the Dream of the Rood probably makes the best sense. The poet does not believe that the cross had some sort of sentient experience. In fact, when I teach Old English poetry, I use a volume edited by S.A.J. Bradley called Anglo-Saxon Poetry. And Bradley talks about the importance during the Middle Ages of something called compunction. And it may be, I don't know if any of your denominations use the word compunction. It's probably a little different. But a successful poet will, make it a point for the reader or the hearer to have not just an experience, but be compelled to draw nearer to the things of the Lord. And so the Dream of the Rood is meant to draw its readers nearer to the Lord. Now, it may not be to our taste. I happen to like it. It happens to appeal to my tastes. It may not appeal to our tastes. It may seem odd if we think about, if we think about the Dream of the Rood in a literal mode, or if we approach it as systematic theology, which it is not. It's not trying to do systematic theology. It's trying to present allegorically a picture of Christ as a conqueror. So the hearer would likely not be confused. The hearer would see it as maybe a meditation or a devotional response to the crucifixion of Christ from the perspective of the cross for sure, but from the perspective of somebody who wonders, like, how is Christ heroic if he's being crucified? So the Dream of the Rood, of course, imagines the young warrior Christ climbing up onto the cross and being totally in control of the situation, which Christians would affirm, right? We would affirm that God never lost control of that. But what does it look like when you're doing a poetic meditation of it? Maybe it looks something like this. Christinette J. Mentions the word Florilegium. So Florilegium is a book that would compile a number of sayings or wise episodes. We could think of it as almost an anthology. So she quotes the idea of the Florilegium copied by a scribe into a manuscript. She's looking actually at the introductory material to the Dream of the Rood, and asks why the authors begin from the viewpoint of the tree, and then becomes a viewpoint of God and Jesus when it's said, "My mother Mary," and bleeding on one side. So alas, I didn't look at the poem right before I came here. However, Bradley, in his treatment of the poem, he points out that the Dream of the Rood, first of all, it's a dream vision. So the speaker of the poem describes falling asleep, having a dream where the cross speaks to the dreamer, and the cross imagines Christ, and then turns into this kind of almost devotional ecstasy where praying to the cross, whatever you may, in my tradition we would not pray to the cross, but praying to the cross is a way to draw nearer to the Lord. So the authors use these different points of view, and wherever they begin, they employ these different points of view in order to emphasize certain aspects of Christ's redemption. So if you're viewing Christ coming to you, if you're the cross, and you view Christ coming to you in this very strong way and embraces you, as the cross, you may realize, oh my goodness, I'm implicated in the death of Christ. In doing my duty, and he says things like, the cross says, like, I dare not buckle under, even though I'm holding Jesus. The implication of guiltiness, participating in the death of the Lord, isn't something to cause the reader to go, oh my goodness, now I'm very depressed. It should compel the reader then to turn to Christ for forgiveness. And the different points of view serve, I think, that overall purpose. Crystal S. Asks, why did society think the people would reap redemption over Christ's battling over sins? So we need the forgiveness of sins. Maybe in Anglo-Saxon society, so Anglo-Saxons are Germanic tribes, and there's been a lot of discussion among scholars concerning the Anglo-Saxon temperament or the Germanic temperament, broadly speaking. So there's a view, I kind of believe it, or I kind of hold to it. I hold to it loosely, just, part of me wonders if there's more complex than this, but Germanic tribes are often described as very honor-based, very interested in heroic deeds, and might not be willing to accept a god that is, passively put to death. Even Odin, who is described as sacrificing himself to himself and hanging on a tree in certain parts of old Norse mythology. Even Odin still has this heroic quality about himself, and some speculate that a poem like Dream of the Rood would appeal to an audience that wanted an active, heroic Christ. I don't think it's blasphemous to do that. I don't think it's sacrilegious to do it. In fact, it does reveal an aspect of God's, not just his sovereignty, but his omnipotence, right? His all-powerfulness. So we do say that Christ suffered on the cross, but that's because God allows himself to be acted upon, not because some force overpowered him. Michaela B. asks about the name. Why is the poem called The Dream of the Rood? So it's a title actually given by editors. It appears in I believe it's the Vercelli manuscript. There are like 4 big Anglo-Saxon collections of poetry. The Dream of the Rood appears in one of those, along with Helene. Actually, let me consult my S.A.J. Bradley to find out which manuscript it appears in. It's in the Vercelli book, so probably either written by Cynewulf or in the Cynewulf school. Just nod your heads and say, yes, Dr. Elam, of course. So it's probably an editorially supplied title, and it just comes down to us as helpful for identifying what the poem is. It's a dream about the rood, which is the Old English word for crossbeam or tree. So it's the dream of the cross. Sometimes we use that kind of language, right? The tree on which Christ hung. That's how it gets its title. Deanne M. then goes and a bit further and mentions the 5 gems that are on the cross, above the cross. They're actually on what's called the Beama, I believe is what it is. The axle beam, it's like the cross beam of the cross, this part of the cross. So it's covered in gold, it's gem encrusted, and there are 5 gems. They're not each mentioned, but that there are 5 gems is mentioned. There's not a lot of scholarly discussion about those 5 gems. Usually the discussion is about the gems are there in the first place. My reading of it is that the 5 gems, because of the suffering emphasized in the cross of Christ, and because of it's kind of a weird, almost metamorphic image where the blood of Christ and the shimmering quality of the gold kind of blend together. So I read the 5 gems as being the 5 wounds of Christ, 2 in the hands, 1, 2, 1 for the feet, holding both feet together, 3, the crown of thorns being a wound, number 4, and then the spear in the side being the 5th wound. That's my hunch as to what they mean. I'm sure people speculate about it all over the place. I have not encountered a lot of scholarship on it. There's an interesting article in a journal called Medium Ivum, which just means Middle Ages, from 1970, I believe. You could probably punch in Medium Ivum 1970, that discusses some of the gem imagery, and visual quality of the Dream of the Rood. Philomena has a question regarding translation, and isn't Anglo-Saxon its own language? Yes, and usually we think of the language of the Anglo-Saxons as Old English, but as I mentioned in my video overview last time, there's a few decades ago they were kind of used interchangeably. Old English is its own language. You can go out and buy an Old English dictionary. I mean, not at the bookstore. You'd have to go on Amazon or something and buy an Old English dictionary. It is its own language. It's not used anymore. Eventually it developed into what is currently modern English after going through, phases of Norse conquest and Norman conquest, the big one in 1066, changing the language and shifting it until we finally have modern English. It is its own language. I'm not sure how Google Translate does their algorithms. All right, so now let's switch over to Inferno. Kimberly B. Asks about the World of Dante site and wonders about Dante being exiled from Florence and why he was exiled from Florence. So Dante, if you haven't figured it out, Dante has a beef with Boniface VIII, who was the Pope in 1300, when Dante imagines himself having these experiences. So the Pope, there was a lot of Florentine machinations, and Guelphs and Ghibellines were two major parts. By the time Dante comes on the scene, the Ghibellines have pretty much given way to the Guelph party. And listen, you don't need to remember any of this stuff, and I am not an expert in Florentine politics of the 13th and 14th century. But if you go to our edition for the class, Mark Muse's translation of the comedy, and I've bookmarked it because you all sent me to my bookshelves again. I've bookmarked the episode here, and I'll just read to you what Muse says. He gives an account of this. In 1301, Boniface summoned Charles of Valois and his army to Italy to help in the reconquest of Sicily. He hoped to use him to neutralize the anti-papal forces in Florence. And it says that Dante was sent as one of 3 envoys of the commune to the Pope. After initial talks, the other envoys were dismissed, but Dante was detained, and during his absence from Florence, the city was basically overrun by the Black Guelphs, right? They stage a revolution and take control. Dante was in the White Guelph party. So they were the party that saw there should be a separation between papal power and state power. Dante writes a treatise called De Monarchia, where he discusses his view that earthly authorities like kings should rule over carnal matters, and spiritual authorities like popes and bishops should rule over moral matters. And so Dante found himself sentenced to 2 years of exile. And the detail, they're kind of messed up actually. This is on page 31 of the translation. You can read a little bit more about it. But Dante's kind of in a catch-22 situation. So he was part of this diplomatic team. He was detained, exiled in absentia, right? So while he's not there, he's exiled, and then basically called back to answer charges, which he, of course, doesn't do because they could, grab him on sight. So that's a lot of the background in Dante's mind in Inferno. And Florentine politics does inform Inferno. However, what Dante's doing with the Florentine politics is not so much commenting, or not so much exploring politics per se, but he's using it to think about what happens when people sin, what happens when people give themselves over to sin on small scales, like Francesca de Rimini in the Second Circle, or on larger scales, like some of the betrayers we find in the Ninth Circle of the Inferno. Joshua N. asks a question concerning the blending of historical, mythical, fictional elements. Was it a unique thing to do this? He talks about, I actually like your phrase, Joshua, Dante's wildly imagined Christian hell with trips on the river Styx, etc., etc. I think that's I like that phrasing. So it wouldn't be unusual to blend maybe Christian elements, or to think about pagan things in Christian terms. Virgil's fourth eclogue was thought by some to be a proto-messianic prophecy. We're not reading it in this class. You could probably sit down and read Virgil's fourth eclogue in about 20 minutes. It's not totally unusual. But what Dante is doing, this is very astute, what he's doing in his architecture of the Inferno is he is explicitly borrowing from Virgil. And he's not trying to hide that. So in the fourth Georgic of Virgil, and in Book 6 of the Aeneid, not Dante, Virgil describes some of the physical characteristics of the underworld. And in Georgics 4, where he's telling the story of Orpheus going into the underworld, Orpheus looks and he sees the 9 rings of the river Styx that enclose the dead. And so Dante, and remember, Virgil is his guide through the Inferno. So Dante is signaling to the readers that I'm going to borrow from this pagan poet for my architecture of the Inferno. And it's appropriate that the pagan poet has the architecture of hell. In fact, and many of you asked questions about the mythical monsters and so forth in Inferno. They do not appear outside of the Inferno. There's one exception at the top of Mount Purgatory where we see a griffin. But the griffin there, with its eagle head and lion hindquarters, is supposed to represent the dual nature of Jesus. And Dante will not represent Jesus in the comedy. I think for him that would be a step too far. So he represents him allegorically in the griffin. Other than that, all of the mythological beasts and creatures from antiquity and pagan sources, they're in hell appropriately enough. And I think that's Dante also kind of commenting on, I don't want to say it's commenting on the value of pagan thinking, but showing that pagan thinking ultimately can't raise anybody to the level of salvation. So, and in Aeneid 6, when Aeneas goes into the underworld to find his father Anchises, the Sibyl of Apollo, who's apparently she's new on the job and kind of having trouble, channeling Apollo, and she's weird in some ways. The Sibyl of Apollo says to Aeneas, okay, we're going to go over to the right-hand side and meet your father in the Elysian fields. On the left-hand side are the punished, the damned dead. And that is Dante's cue to talk in the Inferno about always turning to the left. Maybe you notice that. Like, why does he always talk about going to the left-hand side? Because in Aeneid 6, the Sibyl says the punished go to the left-hand side of the underworld. So Dante, I mean, it's brilliant. Oh my goodness. If I occasionally have done independent studies on the Divine Comedy. I would love to teach a class on the entire comedy. We are only scratching the even if that, we are only scratching the surface of the intricacies and the depth and the density of Dante's comedy. So he's doing it on purpose. Yes, he's mashing up things on purpose. But also there's a sense that Dante's Divine Comedy is also of its own kind. Nothing really, there have been portrayals of hell before this in Anglo-Saxon poetry, Middle English poetry, but until the comedy there was nothing of the scale of what Dante was doing. It's kind of its own kind, though he does borrow some techniques from here and there. Sophia has a number of questions. I'll concentrate on the idea about the word comedy. So comedy in the Christian sense, and in Dante's mind, and he does talk about this in his letter to Can Grande della Scala, the comedy aspect of it is the freedom of the soul after bondage. So comedies they usually end with a marriage or some kind of reaffirmation of societal order. Now, I know that some comedies are, dirty or bawdy or randy in some way. Like, I get that. I understand that. But as a genre, they typically reinforce social order. They exclude those who are dangerous to society. If you read Twelfth Night and you feel sorry for Malvolio, don't feel sorry for Malvolio. He is a complication. His name literally means bad will, evil will. And he is excluded from society because he's a threat to social order. So the comedy really is about affirming reintegration, not disintegration of the soul, but reintegration of the soul and which can only be achieved through the power of the Holy Spirit, by God, the sacrifice of Christ, the edicts of God the Father, and our being empowered by the Holy Spirit. So it's God who does it all. But the comedy is the happy ending, really. That's where the title ultimately is leading. Now I've got a group of 3 questions here from Leela H., Hannah C., and Hillary M. Concerning the Leela asks, the Dante, he strays from the true path. Why does the author take someone already at the low point in life and drive them further into the furnace? Hannah asks about, Virgil. Is he really a good person? And Hillary also wonders about Virgil. What does he represent? So Dante, at the low point of his life, I mean, it's a fair question, Leela. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. It's a fair question. I think what Dante is trying to show is he still has not recognized what sin is. In Canto 1 of Inferno, he actually tries to climb a mountain toward the light. And the 3 beasts, the lion, the leopard, and the she-wolf, I think I got the order wrong. I think it's leopard, lion, she-wolf. The 3 beasts prevent him from climbing the mountain to where he sees the sun. And that's a signal to the reader that he is not able to get to the light on his own. He actually needs to realize just how bad sin is. There's so much going on previously in Dante's life concerning Beatrice, how he's working through it in a work called the Vita Nuova. We're not going into any of that, but he probably imagines himself at that period in the past as not really getting how bad sin is. So he needs to see how bad it is. And rather than abandoning the poet or abandoning the pilgrim himself, really, rather than abandoning the traveler in hell, the poet wants to draw him out of hell, wants to climb the Purgatorio. And he can only climb the Purgatorio through the power of the Holy Spirit. There's a metaphor of the light you can only climb during the daytime, which is a representation of the Holy Spirit. So anyway, we're not doing Purgatorio in this class. So I mean, it does seem cruel, but it is not excessive, at least from Dante's perspective. Some of us may think like, oh my goodness, he's really down on himself. I understand that. But for Dante, I think he realizes he needs that intensity of experience to drive him. And then as far as Virgil goes, so literally he's Virgil the poet who lives in limbo when he's not guiding Dante around and running errands, I guess, in the underworld. Literally that's what he is. Metaphorically, he usually stands for human reason. And human reason has, it's a God-given quality. It has important, I was going to say usefulness. I don't want to reduce it to utility, but it's an important aspect of who we are. And I know that we're not reading Purgatorio, but Virgil actually can only guide Dante to Mount Purgatory and up to the top of Mount Purgatory, and even then they take on a second guide, because human reason ultimately cannot get us to God. It requires grace and revelation to get to God, which Beatrice represents, and she becomes Dante's guide, starting at the top of Purgatorio, the end of Purgatorio, and then rising through the spheres in Paradiso, right? So divine love, grace, revelation, that's the guide for the final leg of the journey. But Virgil usually represents human reason. I don't know what was going on in Dante's life. I know historically what's going on, but I don't know what the moment was where he seems to have been reading Virgil and had some sort of an aha moment and saw it being important enough to have Virgil as his guide through this journey, and also recognizing as a Christian, right, Dante as a Christian, Virgil cannot get me to the place I want to go. Human reason, yes, it's God-given, but it is fallen and ultimately needs grace to bridge the gap, right? Christ, the Holy Spirit, God the Father, the triune God is the only one who can conduct us to himself, even though human reason can tell us what is right and wrong, good and bad. We have that capacity. It just doesn't save us. Okay. Moving on to Kimberly R. Kimberly R. has a question about, actually maybe I had Kimberly R.'s question grouped in here. My page kind of broke it onto another page. Why must Dante go through hell to escape hell? Why Virgil insists it's God's will that Dante pass through hell. Remember, there are a number of times where some of the denizens of hell ask, like, what's this guy doing here? And Virgil will say he has a special dispensation to go through here. It's God's will that he goes through. So I think my previous answer touches on this point, right? At the risk of repeating myself, Dante has to recognize just how bad sin is. And as I mentioned in the overview, the video overview, Dante's Inferno is alarming, right? It's chaotic. It's not like the place of dignified suffer. Here I suffer in a dignified way. It's crazy and unhinged, which is appropriate for being separated from God. And the question I ask to each of my classes when I teach Inferno, and I think I asked it in the overview, is what if hell is worse than Dante can present? What if hell is even worse than that? The chaos, the madness, the utter giving over of oneself to sin, and the fullness of sin, the ripeness of sin, if sin could ever be ripe. But you know what I mean, like the ultimate nth degree of sin. Sin is worse. Hell is probably worse than this. And remember too that Dante, he is told in a couple of places that, what he sees in the Inferno is just a stopgap measure until Jesus returns in the final judgment and then sends all sinners along with the rebellious angels into the lake of fire. So he's still aware of that. But he needs to see just how bad sin is. Eric B. and Sarah S., I've got your questions also grouped together, and this has to do with the harrowing of hell. Eric asks, why would Dante place people like Moses and Noah in limbo before Christ's sacrifice? And Sarah asks, in a similar vein, a question about Dante in limbo. Is he saying that before Abraham, Noah, and David were called up from limbo, there was no one in heaven? So this is a doctrine known as, or an event, I guess, I don't know if it's a doctrine, known as the harrowing of hell, or the plundering of hell. And it's based on some scriptures. I'm embarrassed, I don't remember where they're at, but they have to do with Christ going down and preaching his victory to the souls imprisoned. I think it might even be to the spirits imprisoned. There's also some of this is informed by the parable of the rich man and the Lazar, right? The Dives and Lazarus, the rich man and the beggar. So there seems to be this idea, and I'm not a theologian, right? So I don't do medieval theology, and I know bits and pieces of it here and there. But there is this idea that Christ goes down and by his actual sacrifice in time pays the price for sin that may have been the only barrier keeping David and Noah, the patriarchs, from coming into the presence of Jesus himself. So they sometimes it's described as Abraham's bosom. This what Dante has in the limbo. It is, it's an odd thing, and like some things, that are super technical or super mysterious, the more we look into it, the weirder it becomes. And maybe Dante's done a little bit of that. There are places in Old English poetry, for example, where the devils they'll see Christ coming and they'll try to lock the gate against him, and he comes and blows out the gate, and then they try a legal argument against Jesus and say, well, technically we're supposed to get Adam and all of his offspring, and then Jesus says, I'm going to honor that agreement, but I'm a bit of a lawman myself, and I've got this new deal here. It's more complex than that, or more. The details are finer. I'm paraphrasing a lot. So he's just inherited this view. If you I think it's the Nicene Creed. If you do creedal recitations in your church, so we do, occasionally we'll recite Nicene Creed or Apostles' Creed. There's the part where it said he descended into hell. That's kind of, it's not that, all of that harrowing of hell in that statement, but that statement is kind of an aspect of the harrowing of hell. Again, you don't have to love it, you don't have to agree with Dante's perspective, but this is how he's thinking it through. All right, Jennifer S. asks about, Caesar and Brutus and Cassius, and why Caesar is in limbo and not in a ring of hell. Maybe it talks about the political historical views of the day. Judas, Brutus, and Cassius make sense, but some of the other choices don't make sense. I actually share your views. There are times when I see somebody in the Inferno, or even in the Purgatorio or the Paradiso, and I wonder to myself, I'm not sure why Dante has this person here. I don't know. We're not inside his head. Definitely, Brutus is an ambiguous figure. Even in Roman history, he's an ambiguous figure. Did he do the right thing? He's motivated. And I'm not even talking about the Shakespeare play. I'm talking about Plutarch, a major source of Shakespeare. Brutus is kind of this patriotic / tragic figure. Cassius, on the other hand, is a clearer cut example of somebody who suffers from envy. And I just taught Julius Caesar in another class, so it's fresh in my mind, and we'll be going over it in this class too. Cassius, he seems to really hate Julius Caesar, and so he's not motivated by patriotism or any sort of underlying morality. It makes sense, I suppose, that he's down in the ninth level of hell. If you feel sorry for Brutus, maybe it's unfair that he's down there. Judas absolutely makes sense, along with Satan too, in the central well of hell. It makes sense that they are there. I'm not sure why Dante makes all of the choices that he makes. Sometimes he will discuss it, right? He will say, hey, I'm surprised to see you here, or I'm surprised to see this person here. And then he'll get an explanation about it, but not always. So I'm not sure. He probably looks at Julius as a proto-virtuous figure who, was still a pagan and doesn't get to go to heaven. Okay, Kimberly T. Asks a specific question about the suicides and the bodies, right? The physical bodies in the Inferno. She says, why are the suicide deaths not deserving of bodies and the traitors are? So the journey, or the details, and the journey also, is they are highly symbolic. The suicide chooses to separate the soul from the body, and so the fulfillment of that, right, the fullness of that sin is the permanent separation of soul and body. Now, I don't mean to raise anybody's hackles by saying it this way, but from Dante's perspective, the suicide ultimately desires that his body be separated from his soul untimely, right? The untimely separation is what the suicide wants. And so the punishment in the Inferno represents that, the fulfillment of that desire. It also probably fits the contrapasso idea. You know, it's fitting that somebody who takes their own life, separates soul from body, should also have the soul, not just as fulfillment, but also as punishment, have the soul separated from the body. So that's why the suicides are in that position. They're actually also in a category, the same category as those who do violence to their substance or violence to their property, things that they own that would be considered substantive. And the guy who's running away from the dogs and gets torn up right before we meet the suicides, he wants violence done to his substance, and for all of eternity, he can have violence done to his substance, or at least until Christ comes back for the second judgment. He will have the fulfillment of that sin over and over again. So that's why the different bodies are situated differently in Inferno. It's highly symbolic. The architecture is symbolic. The physical details are highly symbolic. Lori M. Asks about Canto 5, verse 39, those who make reason slave to appetite. What's he talking about, making reason a slave to appetite? So the medieval view, which they inherit from the classical era, is that we have appetites, we have appetitive desire. Yes, I need to eat, but perhaps my appetite turns toward chocolate, or it turns toward meat or something like that. So my appetite turns, or my appetite is drawn to things. My appetite can actually control reason if my reason is not strong enough, or if I have not conditioned my reason to be in charge of appetite. So when we see the phrase, those who make reason slave to appetite, that's what Dante is talking about. He actually goes into a big discussion about this in the Paradiso, the relationship between reason and appetitive desire. We're not going through that in here, but the reason should judge whether or not the appetite is rightly going toward the thing it's drawn to. So appetite in and of itself is not sinful, not in and of itself, but it may lean toward things that are not good for it, either never good for it ever, the desire to eat, a poisonous plant, for example, that would never be good for it, or it might not be good in the moment, to eat too much food. The reason would say, eating food is good, but the appetite is now drawn inordinately to food, and I reason I'm going to stop that. If appetite's in charge, then sin follows. Inevitably it follows. Flynn asks about the in Canto 32, Bocca degli Abbate's hair. Dante pulls his hair and asks about the sin of betrayal. Is it there in Canto 32? It's actually in Canto 33, the episode that I'm thinking of. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to turn to Canto 33 to read the account. Musa believes that Dante commits every single one of the sins that he witnesses. I think he's talking about categorically, not every single particular sin. I've been teaching comedy a long time, and there are times when I wonder, I'm not sure Dante's committing the sin in, the circle of the lustful. There's a way of thinking about it that way. In any case, he definitely commits betrayal down in the ninth circle. So in Canto 33, starting in line line 115, so he's making a deal, right? Break off these hard veils covering my eyes. In 115, Dante, who is talking to Friar Alberigo, he says, if this is what you want, right, if you want me to do that, clear the ice away from your eyes. If this is what you want, tell me your name, and if I do not help you, may I be forced to drop beneath this ice. And what happens? We skip now to, let's say, line 148. He says, but now, at last, give me the hand. This is, again, Alberigo talking, Friar Alberigo talking. Give me the hand you promised. Open my eyes. And then Dante, the speaker, says, I did not open them. To be mean to him was a generous reward. And that's betrayal. It's also the sin of envy. So envy is not just wanting things that other people have, but it's also delighting in other people's misfortune. I think there's a German word, Schadenfreude, which describes that phenomenon. So it's in the large class of envy. So Dante absolutely commits the sin of betrayal in the ninth circle. Now, ironically, this is the beauty of Dante's artistry. When he says, may I go below the ice if I don't keep my promise, what he doesn't know is he is going to go below the ice, and he's actually going to incur the penalty that he's made for himself, but by God's grace, as one of the elect, the penalty that he, punishment, whatever curse that he ascribes to himself, becomes a means of grace for him. It doesn't mean that the oath was good or that his betrayal was good, but it shows Dante realizing God is working out some crazy things in my life to my benefit, and these experiences are alarming experiences. Now, does Dante believe that he took this literal journey? No, he does not. He knows that he's imagining it. But it's probably being informed, the journey is probably being informed by many traumatic experiences that ultimately drew him to God, drove him toward God. And so it's another instance of beauty in the artistry of Dante the poet. Finally, Paula K. and Elijah A., I've also grouped your questions together, and this is regarding Cavalcante and Farinata in the circle of the heretics, right? So it's Canto 10, yes. Paula asks, why does Cavalcante assume that his son would be joining Dante on his journey through hell? And then Elijah asks, what were the notable actions of Farinata and Bocca? That is in Canto 32, and that's what Flynn was alluding to in her question just before. Why did Dante oppose those men? So some of that might be caught up in the Florentine politics, but the point I want to make is about the sixth circle of the Inferno, which is the circle of the heretics. Curiously enough, what's happening there is a representation of the mindset of heresy. So if you notice, Farinata and Cavalcante, each of them, though they ask questions, I think it's Cavalcante who asks the question, right? Even though they ask questions, they don't listen to the answers. Or when they are talking, I think Farinata is the one who is interrupted by Cavalcante, right? He kind of like rises out of the tomb. He's interrupted, but he doesn't acknowledge the interruption. That's what heresy is. Heresy does not pay attention to the things around it, right? It just kind of keeps on going in its own little narrow point of view. And then heresy also misinterprets the information that it receives. So when Cavalcante assumes the worst in Dante, I think Dante pauses, right? Cavalcante's inquiring about his relative, and Dante pauses. Rather than trying to get clarification, he presumes it to mean that his son is doomed. And that's what heresy does. Heresy, rather than trying to clear up, from Dante's perspective anyway, rather than trying to clear up ambiguities in order to arrive at the truth, heresy is just interested in the perception, the narrow perspective of the heretic. And so, the artistry is brilliant. I wish, I know this is another hour-long video. I wish that we could, have a couple of weeks to go over this together. Alas, we don't. I'm glad to answer these. Thank you for asking the questions. I'm glad to answer them for you. Remember that next week, I mentioned at the beginning of this video, next week I'm going to be really picky about the questions focusing on the literary readings themselves. Next week is just the death of King Arthur, Le Morte d'Arthur, or some matter that's closely related to the literary reading. So, keep that in mind as you're formulating your questions. Thank you, everybody, for, again, walking with me on this journey. I'm not trying to be I'm not trying to be saucy by saying this, but, I'm glad to take you all through hell on this journey. So, anyway, I don't mean to offend by saying it that way. I mean, in a polite way. Thank you again, folks. I'll see you again early next week with my video overview. And if you have questions about assignments, etc., in the meantime, let me know, and I will talk to you later. Email, by the way, best way to get a hold of me. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.